I'm John Bruno. Today I'm in the Flyer TV studios in Kennedy Union of the campus of the University of Dayton to talk to you about a unique opportunity for all of the university's first-year students. The first-year immersion program is a partnership between the Dayton Performing Arts Alliance Ballet and UD. On April 3rd, first-year students will experience the ballet Romeo and Juliet in the Schuster Theater in downtown Dayton. Students in a number of disciplinaries are already preparing for the performance by learning about the various aspects of Romeo and Juliet. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Maria Kizel of the Department of English, who will talk to us about the world of Sergei Prokofiev when he created the ballet Romeo and Juliet. Thank you for joining us today, Doctor.
Thank you.
Now, off-camera, we were talking a little bit about Prokofiev and the initial stages that went into him creating and developing Romeo and Juliet. Can you tell the audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first important thing to know is that Prokofiev had been living abroad in Paris for a number of years since the early 1920s, and that his colleagues in the Soviet Union had lured him back because he was already a very successful composer, and it was important for Soviet nationalism to have these great composers living in the Soviet Union. So he was lured back in 1936, which, if you don't know Soviet history, was the first year of the Great Purges, when Stalin began arresting and executing people. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And so Prokofiev came back in 1934 and began composing Romeo and Juliet at an idyllic country estate in Russia, and really quite ignorant of what was going on around him, the arrests and the deaths of many Soviet citizens.
So to piggyback off that, when you describe the Soviet Union during Prokofiev's time and he's creating Romeo and Juliet, the major characteristics that one would expect to be a part of this society would be what?
There was artistic repression. There was surveillance of not just famous people who were in the spotlight, but just regular citizens. There was a great deal of secrecy about what was actually going on. Arrests, political paranoia. So it was a very ugly political landscape that Prokofiev walked into.
And his standing specifically, was he protected because he was this great composer that was revered in society? Did he get special treatment? Was he, not subject to the harsh treatment of the Soviet Union during that time?
Well, yes and no. It's really interesting because the people that were very much revered in the Soviet Union, the writers, the artists, the composers, on one hand, they were celebrated and given commissions to create great works. On the other hand, they were constantly being scrutinized and criticized. So on one hand, Prokofiev received many awards during his lifetime from the Soviet Union, but on the other hand, he was criticized as being anti-Soviet, as being a formalist, which means that he paid too much attention to the form of the work and not enough to the political message.
Okay, now in light of that, I'm wondering, was his creative freedom infringed upon?
Yes, very much so. Although he somehow, according to his own letters and diaries, somehow made peace with it. And it's important to remember that he did see himself as a servant of the Soviet state. He never renounced his Soviet citizenship, even when he lived abroad. So it's a very difficult question to answer, and I think a lot of artists were living kind of this double life. On one hand, wanting to be very creative and expressive, on the other hand, operating within the constraints of the state.
Okay, so back to Romeo and Juliet. Its initial reception within the Soviet Union was met with what?
Again, the story of Romeo and Juliet, the ballet, is really, really interesting. Because he began writing it in 1934, it didn't premiere in Russia until 1940. Because it faced so many obstacles in getting to the stage. It was very much a collaborative process. Radlov, who was a theater director, wanted to have a happy ending. That's kind of the really strange thing about the Soviet Romeo and Juliet, because they saw Romeo and Juliet as the most Soviet of all the Shakespearean dramas, because it portrays the struggle of youth against outdated feudal practices, right? So they wanted to make Romeo and Juliet more proletarian. But then they changed their mind. So this was the nature of censorship in the Soviet Union, is that what was acceptable and unacceptable constantly changed. And so the person who initially suggested the happy ending was then chastised
Okay.
for, changing Shakespeare.
Right.
And so this was a quote from Radlov, the person who suggested it, that I wanted to live more than I wanted Romeo and Juliet to survive at the
Okay.
end of this play. So it went through many, many changes and many, many revisions. It was a very frustrating process. It was initially premiered in Czechoslovakia,
Okay.
which was Soviet controlled, finally premiered on the Soviet stage, and the Russian Soviet stage in 1940, and it was a success, but this was not really the vision that Prokofiev had initially.
Okay. So when you say it wasn't his vision initially, but you say it was a success, explain to me what it was like to attend that ballet. What was it like to be in the midst of a performance of Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet? Was the ballet attended by the wealthy? Was it attended by upper class? Was it a formal experience? What was the experience of going to his ballet like? And then kind of picking up back off that, the reception it received.
Yeah, so the question of who was in the audience is a really interesting one, because the Soviets promoted cultural enlightenment for all people, right? So factory workers would get free tickets to the ballet. Schools would get free tickets. So it was quite democratic,
Okay.
who could afford the ballet.
Okay.
But you were still expected to dress up. 1940 was a time that was financially difficult for many people, so people would dress up modestly to attend the premiere, but it was a formal occasion. And yeah, I mean, the reception was, by the critics, was basically good.
Okay.
But, Stalin had approved of it being staged in Moscow, and it was changed again after its initial premiere to tour
Okay.
the rest of the
Right.
Soviet Union.
So in light of that, as it relates to Prokofiev, what was the historical landscape of the time that he's creating this ballet? Like, not just in the Soviet Union, but maybe throughout Eastern Europe, throughout the Western world. What was the climate at the time?
This is an interesting question because, obviously, Shakespeare is an English play.
Yes.
So, and the Soviet Union was quite insular. So, in some sense, we could think of Prokofiev as playing a somewhat diplomatic role in the
Okay.
sense that, he was promoting sort of European culture within the Soviet Union, and Romeo and Juliet, the Soviet ballet, did travel around Europe as well, even when its creator was no longer allowed to leave the Soviet state.
And fascinating. So how was it received throughout Europe?
It had a good reception. In London, they had actually seen the version with the happy ending,
Okay.
and it was received better than it was in the Soviet
No way.
Union,
Okay.
which was strange. But I
Yeah.
think they probably just thought, oh, those crazy Russians,
Absolutely, yeah.
and I'm open to it, right? It's
Yeah.
by a Russian.
Sure. So, I guess advice you would have for students when they go and they see the play, what would you say to keep in mind when you see Prokofiev's version of this Romeo and Juliet, like in terms of, I don't know, preconceived notions they might have going into Romeo and Juliet? What's one thing you would like them to keep with them when they watch this?
I guess I would want to keep in mind the tortured creative process of Prokofiev, and the fact that this was a product of many people working together and being at odds with one another. So if it sometimes seems strange, it's because Prokofiev was trying to do the impossible, to make a proletarian Romeo and Juliet while at the same time remaining faithful to
Right.
the original text.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Once again, Romeo and Juliet will be performed for the first-year students on April 3rd at the Schuster Center in downtown Dayton. Thanks for joining us today, Doctor.